was so incompetent that it ended up that way. When the military rule started, it was called the Rice Bowl of Asia. It would probably, Rangoon would be Bangkok today if it hadn't been for the military rule, because the airlines were positioning to use that as the hub. But the last military rule changed that. The left is, a physical depiction of Myanmar. So you can see from the green that it's mainly fertile valleys, fertile lowlands. 3 river valleys running almost the length of the country. So very fertile land. And that's the land of the Burmans, the majority population, who comprise about 85% of the total population. Around the perimeter, around the highlands, the browner areas, are where the ethnic minorities, mainly live. It's not quite true, because down in the Delta, there are an awful lot of Korean people, but historically, they were up there in the highlands, and weren't really, apart from the Korean and the Shan, weren't really part of the colonial Burma. They weren't interesting enough for the colonial rulers. They just ripped out the resources. So when it came to 1948 independence, Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, entered into an agreement with many of these ethnic minorities to bring them into a federation when they got independence. But he was shot, assassinated 6 weeks before independence, and that promise has never been delivered. So apart from a period of democratic government between 1948 until 1962, when General Ne Win took power, and the 5 or 10 years, depending on how you see it, of transition to democracy from 2010 to 2020, this country has never experienced democratic rule. It went from Burmese kingdoms and to colonial rule, to a brief period of democracy, then nearly 60 years of military rule, and 5 years of kind of generals in suits, and then the election of Aung San Suu Kyi's National Democracy Party. It has a very poor education and health system, because that was an area that was completely neglected by the military rulers as they enriched themselves and their cronies. Just looking at the map on the right, you're probably wondering what that funny distortion is, but it's a projection according to population distribution. So as you can see, most people live on the lowlands, and the smaller ethnic populations, and there are 135 officially recognised ethnic minorities, and of course there are many others who claim recognition as well. They tend to live around the perimeters and the hill areas. Who supplies hardware to the military? Well, for that period from, and this is kind of, it's come off the top, but that's a period from 1990 to 2016. So to be fair to some of those European countries, I think they suspended their supply of arms and hardware to Myanmar when the European Union imposed sanctions. But everybody has a culpability for supplying arms. Certainly in the last 10 years, one could say that with the recognition that they've had, the military have been able to modernise, the army. It's a very large and well-equipped army, more than 400,000 troops, which puts it larger than the Indonesian army, for example. And this is the flashpoints are the kind of major conflicts that have existed in Myanmar for the last 60 years, because as a result of that failure to deliver on the Pan Long Agreement, there has been civil war of varying levels in various parts of the country, but mainly around those ethnic areas for the whole period since independence. And there are still 9 active non-state armies, and these aren't just, men in the jungle with a few old rifles. Most of these armies are larger than the New Zealand Army, and armies like the Kachin Independence Army have more than 10,000 troops. Amongst them, there's remnants of the old Communist Party army, there's remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's army that spent quite a bit of time over the border there in Myanmar, causing trouble at the end of the Second World War. And those conflicts have almost exclusively been between each of those ethnic armies and the Burmese army on the other hand. The Burmese army is the Burman army, so it also represents the dominant culture, and in the battle between the ethnic groups and the Union Army. The current constitution, the 2008 constitution, was put in place in 2008 as part of what it called its roadmap to disciplined democracy. Roadmap to disciplined democracy. Many aspects of it have been criticised, but in particular, it provides for an automatic 25% representation of military appointees in both houses of parliament. So when you look at their sitting in parliament, 25% are military in uniforms sitting there as of right. It excludes from the president and vice president positions any candidate with a familial relationship with a foreigner. That's the anti-Aung San Suu Kyi cause, because she married an Englishman. Ironically, it also caught the military, who appointed a vice president, as they're entitled to do as well. One of the vice presidents is a military appointee, and it turned out that his daughter was married to an Australian of all people, so he was disqualified from office. He had to leave office. There's also an interesting little feature that in the NLD government, one of the vice presidents more recently in the 2015 government was a Chin man by the name of Henry Vantillo. Now, Henry lived in New Zealand for, I think, 3 or 4 years. His wife did a PhD at Otago University in theology, and Henry, during that time, worked at the Finnegan Meatworks, very close to Balclutha, where I was born. So, of course, he's no longer vice president, he's in custody. So, the NLD, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won the first genuine election with a landslide. And despite the worst efforts of the military, and there have been many, if we kind of look behind the curtain around the whole Rohingya issue, it was the military and their coalition with the extreme Buddhist nationalists that drove up all of that hatred and agenda. In fact, they can trace it on Facebook, and the military have been very active in trying to position Aung San Suu Kyi in a political situation where she is alienated from, the popular majority of the Burmese. But all of that effort failed. And so last November, in the second genuine election, not only did her support not diminish, which was expected, particularly in the light of the Rohingya issue and other less than glowing sort of leadership qualities, she actually won a greater number of seats, and the military proxy party, the USDP, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, grossly misnamed, only won 33 seats in a parliament of 476. A complete humiliation, and I think that hurt them a lot. So why the coup, and why has it taken place now? Well, there have been rumours of coups off and on over recent years, but I think the February coup took most people by surprise for a mix of reasons. Firstly, the 2008 constitution had been put in place, as I said, by the military and provided them with immense power. I mean, it's often said in Myanmar that we have two governments, and it's the military government, not the elected government, that has the power. So they were still there with all of that power. And of course, that 25% automatic representation in Parliament. They also controlled and were entitled to appoint the ministers of the key ministries, Home Affairs, Border Affairs, and Defence, and what was called the General Administration Department, which I'll come back to later, because that's a crucial sort of operationalising department that extends, its tentacles throughout the country. The second point is that the military and the generals had retained all of their ill-gotten gains. I mean, they bled the Myanmar economy for themselves and their cronies. The military themselves have got huge holdings in the country. At one stage, something like 50% of the economy was owned and controlled by the military and their cronies. I don't know what the percentage is currently, but I doubt if it's particularly different. Aung Min Lang, who has been pointing a finger at Aung San Suu Kyi for corruption, his family is incredibly corrupt. I mean, how does a general on a general's salary, well, not the general, but the general's son and family members own, supermarket chains and tourism businesses and a whole lot of other enterprises, as well as getting concessions, in what's again misnamed the People's Park in Yangon, where people are actually only allowed to go once a year, but there is a kind of a concessionary area on the edge, where they have restaurants and things. Min Aung Hlaing's son has a concession there at about 1/20th of the rental of all of the other occupants. The third thing is that the generals were generally, and certainly before the Rohingya crisis, were welcomed internationally. They were feted by the EU and other countries, so they were getting a respectability and acknowledgement that they seek so much. And fourthly, it seemed the coup was unlikely because the people of Myanmar had really embraced the idea of democracy with enthusiasm, and particularly younger generations were well connected globally. Internet access, smartphone use is amongst the highest of any country in Southeast Asia, having gone in the space of 4 or 5 years from the lowest. And it seemed that Myanmar had opened up to the world in a way which couldn't be reversed. But in retrospect, I think when you just look back with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that there are possible reasons why they made their move. Firstly, I think the generals were starting to feel a bit insecure. Firstly, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD had made a concerted effort to get constitutional change to remove the 25% military representation in Parliament. Other changes too, but that was the key one that threatened them. They failed, they didn't get it passed, but it demonstrated that the government was wanting to move from a military-controlled country to a country where the elected government controlled the military. But the second thing, and I think probably more significantly, was that at the end of 2019, the NLD government moved control of the General Administration Department from the Home Affairs, from one of the military-controlled departments, to the, I think it's called the Ministry of Union Office or something, directly under the control of the government and the president. There had been a widespread belief, I mean, this had been kind of talked about as an obvious thing to try and do, because the General Administration Department, as I said, is kind of like the operationalising division for all government ministries. So they have offices in every township, they know everything, they do everything, and they are essentially the government. So this was a really important part of the NLD moving to a situation where the military didn't control this really important apparatus, but secondly, that it actually moved to a position where it could be more effectively controlled at a regional and state level by the regional and state governments. And that was seen to be a possible step towards devolution or even, federal government. So, when they actually did this in 2019, it caused some ripples, and I'm sure that was another black mark that the military put on the board as a reason for planning the coup. The second reason, I think, is that the AntiCorruption Commission, which was led until last year by a former general himself, and Minister of Labour, who was the Minister of Labour when I worked in Myanmar in 2012-13, was actually doing its job very effectively. Aung San is perhaps one of the few generals with any integrity, and he not only was very committed to labour reform when I was there, but he moved on in the NLD government to be chair of the Anti-Corruption Commission. And as I said, the junta is essentially an oligarchy of generals and their cronies, and so they've got very good reason to fear an anti-corruption commission. Rather unsettling for them. As I said, the anti-Aung San Suu Kyi strategies had failed in spite of all their efforts to tarnish her popularity, to associate her with the West, to associate her with liberalism, to associate her with not being religious and devout enough and extreme enough Buddhist nationalist. She actually endured that and emerged in the 2005 and the election last year with an increased majority, which, as well as being, an indication of complete failure by the proxy military party with its 33 seats, it was also a measure of just how much the people of Myanmar reject the military, and that really hurts them too, because they do really believe that they're the kind of saviour of the country. The fourth reason I'd put together with the fifth, really, is that the military felt disrespected by Aung San Suu Kyi over their voter fraud claims. Now, okay, I think these voter fraud claims were probably inspired by Trumpism in the United States, and they had about as much substance to them, it would sound like. But because the Electoral Commission looked at it and said there was no problem, the international observers could see no problem, but the military felt that Aung San Suu Kyi didn't give sufficient consideration to trying to find some way of at least inquiring into the issue rather than simply dismissing it. The fifth reason is that COVID provided a bit of cover for their actions, that the country wasn't in a normal state because of COVID, Very few Westerners there, certainly not the hordes of tourists that would be there at this time of the year, so it wasn't a bad timing. The sixth reason is that it seems to have a new superpower sponsor, Russia. It's true, Russia's, I think, always been there, but we always have talked in terms of China as being the dominant influence there, and then suddenly Russia emerges. The Russian Minister of Defence was in Naypyidaw a week before the coup, met with Min Aung Hlaing in Naypyidaw, didn't meet with any Minister of Government. I'm not sure you meant to even visit a country. The diplomats in the room will tell me that, whether this is correct or not, without actually acknowledging the elected government. He just came in, met with Min Aung Hlaing, it's thought, discussed the prospect of the coup and got their support. And yeah, it's no coincidence that the Deputy Defence Minister of Russia was the attendance at the Armed Services display in Naypyidaw on Saturday, sitting alongside Min Aung Hlaing, an event at which normally military attaché level representatives from countries are provided. And then, I guess, the almost final reason is that Min Aung Hlaing himself has political ambitions. His term as the Senior General expires this year, and it's widely known that he would like to be the President of Myanmar. Now, I would guess that the November election result kind of brought it home to them that under the current configuration of the Constitution and the electoral arrangements, there's absolutely no way that he'd be elected to that position. So he decided to take the steps that they'd probably been planning for other reasons as well, and trump up these charges against Aung San Suu Kyi about importing handphones or some such thing. And then he says that they will have elections, but I don't think if that happens, and I would have serious doubts about whether it will, that wouldn't be until after he's changed the Constitution, and as he's already done, change control of the Electoral Commission to ensure that the USDP is elected. But the final reason, I think, is probably the underlying reason, is that the roadmap to disciplined democracy never ever intended that the NLD would be elected to government. They didn't put that in place to provide for a genuine democratic process. Why did they put 25% of their own people in Parliament? Because they thought that their proxy party, bear in mind that they are quite often quite deluded about their popularity in the country, surely their party could get 25% plus one vote and they could then rule in perpetuity. But they didn't. They didn't in 2015, and they got even further from it So I think the November result was probably the last straw, and the coup was planned, I think probably long in the planning from the sound of things. It was very smoothly executed. It had clearly been planned in the planning for quite a long time. So what's happened since the coup on the 2nd of February? There's some evidence that the junta thought that the coup would be accepted, that they would be seen as acting in the national interest, intervening to restore fairness to the electoral process and protecting democracy in Myanmar. They purported, and I think this is very significant, they purported and still purport to have acted in accordance with the Constitution in having the acting president declare an emergency, and under the Constitution, an emergency declared by the president automatically transfers legal power to the Commander-in-Chief, Min Aung Hlaing himself. The little flaw in that kind of argument is that the acting president was only acting because the president and the other vice president had both been arrested by the military as part of the coup process. So that left only the military-appointed vice president standing, and guess why he declared an emergency? Because Min Aung Hlaing told him to. So the fiction fooled nobody, but the junta have refused to accept the word coup. They keep threatening the media with action if they refer to them as the coup. The media, by and large, have said, up you, and have continued to refer them to the coup. I think it's a little bit significant that neither the US nor New Zealand initially referred to it as a coup. Certainly in the first hours and day, they didn't say it was a coup, and that was a deliberate decision. So the junta were clearly trying to portray themselves as moderates for a while. But if the generals thought that people would fall for that legitimacy ploy or accept the coup, I think that was quickly dispelled by the sights of millions, literally millions of ordinary people pouring into the streets throughout the country to signal their opposition. And that was in towns and areas where, in 1988, for example, at the time of the student revolution, people hadn't turned out. Mandalay and Yangon were primarily the focus for the protests in 1988. This was countrywide. I think I might have a little... Yeah. So all of those locations. In fact, more, because we've got a young guy in Loikor, in east of Inlay Lake, in Nonstate, and he told me that they had very few people out in 1988, that everybody was out this time, young and old. And that's quite a conservative area. So, having had a taste of democratic government, the people of Myanmar made clear that they didn't want to return to the oppression and the economic ruin of the military rule that they endured from 1962 to 2010. They're also very angry at the arrogance of the military in stealing power. I mean, it was done on the day that those elected MPs would have taken their rightful place in the parliament. So that was significant too. They still hope, for a better life for their kids. The young people that we know really emphasise that. They talk about, the fact that they were a lost generation, that they didn't get a decent education, that they've had the opportunity in the last 10 years to actually remedy that, and that's going to be taken away from their children. So the demonstrations were pretty massive. That's in Yangon, and so's that. And they've been pretty much sustained ever since, as millions of people, young and old, supported by unions and other civil society organisations, took over the streets, very peaceful protests. I mean, remarkably peaceful protests when you think about the numbers of people that were involved. There was none of the kind of fighting, looting, any sort of, disorderly behaviour. The other thing that's a really important part of the campaign is the civil disobedience movement, the refusal to work for the military or anyone that remotely represents them. So, railway workers, transport workers, teachers, health workers, doctors and nurses, but also the private sector banks have been disabled. And I think the military were pretty stunned in the early days of the action, hoping, that it would pass. But instead of passing, the action has intensified. There's no doubt that the civil disobedience movement and that street action has been very effective. The New York Times reported last week, thanks to Bill Rosenberg for sending that through to me, that up to 90% of national government activity has ceased, and many banks and factories remain closed. In fact, our young people say that things are getting pretty tight cash-wise, because one of the things that the military soldiers have been doing has been smashing ATMs. And of course the banks are closed as well. And so people are running out of money as the economy and government grinds to a halt. Mike had a Zoom call with some of the international unions, and Mong Mong, who's the head of the Confederation of Trade Unions of Myanmar, reported that there's been very strong support for the strike from railway workers, and that's meant not just their jobs but their homes, because they have been thrown out of their homes, which were railway housing, because of their refusal to work. We've managed, with support from many of you and from the RMTU in particular in respect of the railway workers, to get money into them to support them, but also to support other workers, airport workers and other workers in other areas of Myanmar, because it's really, really important that this pressure continues on the military. It's actually preventing the junta from gaining effective control of government, especially in the township and rural areas. And that's pretty significant in international law. There's no grounds for what they call de facto recognition even of a government, military government, because they're not in control. They're not in control of their own ministries, and they're not in control of the township and rural areas. So that has all given rise to a desperation on the part of the military, and has led to the increasingly ruthless killing spree, because that is their traditional tactic: terrorise the population, terrorise the ethnic communities, or terrorise the Burman communities in 1988 and at other times. I guess failing to grasp the disastrous optics as each instance of violence is recorded on smartphones and transmitted to the world. Gruesome, horrible images, but really important that we're reminded constantly that this horror continues. But despite the efforts of the junta to close down social media, to actually intimidate people into stopping their resistance, they're continuing. They continued on Saturday when the national government television had broadcast that if they went out on Saturday, they'd be shot in the head or the back. And many of them are shot in the head. There are very innovative aspects of the campaign. There's just one here which I thought was really interesting. That's women's clothing. And these soldiers, who are all very conservative and brainwashed, find it socially unable to walk under women's clothing. So it provided a very useful protection for their community area from the soldiers who were trying to get in. Other things they did was paste pictures of Min Aung Hlaing on the streets, just dozens and dozens of photographs on the streets. The soldiers couldn't walk on Min Aung Hlaing's face. They had to lift every picture before they could get into the area, because an important part of the citizens' campaign in the last couple of weeks has been protecting residential areas from the police and the military. They come in at night. They come in shooting. They're not just shooting at people protesting, they're shooting at into people's houses. Some of the children that have been shot were in their own homes. a young guy that we spoke to who had to go out to the supermarket was worried about wearing his helmet on his bike because he thought that they would probably shoot him because it's protesters who wear helmets. So they've been referring to the military and the police as the terrorists, and that's exactly what they've been doing. So the current situation really at this time is that the people's fight back for democracy in Myanmar is succeeding, in that they've prevented the junta from establishing any sort of de facto control over the country, and they've disabled the economy. They are in control. They are preventing the military from governing. But it actually goes further than that. The elected NLD MPs, those are the ones who should have taken their places in Parliament who haven't been imprisoned yet, established a committee representing Pyondongsu Lator, which is their parliament, so it's called the CRPH, which is acting as a sort of interim government from the Korean-controlled areas close to the Thai-Burma border. But they've got networks throughout the country, and in the last few days it's been reported that local councils have been formed in about 2/3 of all townships, and that's one hell of a lot of townships around the country, and they're succeeding in maintaining control of local government administration. And of course the local people are supporting that because they want the elected government in control rather than the military. So that's a really important signal to foreign governments who dither about recognition that the coup hasn't succeeded and that there's no de facto control or any justification for any form of diplomatic recognition. And it's also, I think, really important evidence of that support from local people. But how long can that be sustained? How long can they sustain a peaceful movement against what is an increasingly ruthless junta, well armed? It's estimated that more than 30,000 people were killed by the military and the police in 1988 before they established or re-established control. And I think these incredibly brave young people and our union brothers and sisters and the people of Myanmar generally are looking to us, knowing the risks that they're facing, and to our governments to do something to help them. And the question, I suppose, is, will we all sit while the 1988 massacre is repeated in 2021? Because that just seems, at least an inevitability on one of the scenarios that I'll come to sooner and later. And if support for people fighting desperately for democracy doesn't move leaders and governments in our region, perhaps there are other more economic and trade interests might do that. Myanmar, as the picture showed, is in a key geopolitical position. China has its economic and transport corridor to provide access to the ocean. Singapore has made huge investment in business investments in Myanmar over the last 10 years. Japan is the biggest development donor, and many countries, including the US, Australia, and New Zealand, have been scrambling to build trade with an economy which has been growing rapidly under democratic rule at a rate of about 7% a year. Our government moved quickly to state its strong public opposition to the coup, and our ambassador and MFAT are no doubt working hard through diplomatic channels. Key ASEAN countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines and Malaysia have opposed the coup, and China has expressed disquiet, I suppose you would describe it as. So we can only hope that these governments are going to ensure that the call by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, for the coup to be reversed will be achieved. And there's a role here, I think, for principled leadership from countries like New Zealand. So I just want to make a few concluding comments to at least provide my thoughts on what the possible scenarios are ahead. As I said, this is a complex country and it's a complex issue, and I'm not an expert, so these are just my take, because I thought when I sat down to think about this as a result of Mike's invitation, I realised I needed to kind of get my thoughts together about what might happen. So I've kind of painted three scenarios, possibly. Scenario one is what I call the back to barracks scenario. That's the one where the junta voluntarily accept that they have almost zero popular support from the Myanmar people for their misguided actions, that they aren't seen as the saviour of the nation, and they return to the barracks and allow the legitimately elected NLD government to resume governance. Now, the military leaders, I'm talking about military leaders, the commanders-in-chief in many key countries have now specifically condemned the Myanmar military for their actions. That included, I think yesterday, Western countries, US, Japan, UK, et al. But perhaps more significantly also the commanders-in-chief of Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia have now all condemned the Myanmar military and told them to pull their head in and go back to barracks. But I think the chances of General Min Aung Hlaing taking this advice and ordering a return to barracks are probably almost zero. So not a very likely prospect. Scenario two, international pressure and governments force a return to the barracks. Now, it's clear that as the atrocities mount up, international popular opinion is becoming pretty outraged. I'm outraged, and I'm sure that's part of the reason why you're here. So it's really up to the governments to give some effect to what people are thinking around the world about this disgusting behaviour. So that kind of brings me to the rather opaque world of diplomacy, and I'm an amateur in this area. But I've said the UN Secretary General has himself called for a reversal of the coup, and that is achievable if public opinion internationally can influence governments, and that's probably all of the key governments, to support it and to put maximum pressure on the junta. And as I said, governments like ours, although small and peripheral, can and have in the past played a principal role in advocating for that sort of objective. It may require diplomatic negotiations and some compromise, and indeed they may be taking place, they have been, but it has been clear from the Myanmar people that the restoration of their elected government immediately must be a key part of any outcome. There is greater ethnic unity now emerging internally around a new constitution, providing for genuine federal democracy. So the Myanmar democracy movement has committed to restoration of the elected government and new constitutional arrangements, and they've called on the world to support them. I think this can be done, but it will be a challenge. But let's say, it's possible. Western countries, lots of outrage and some focus on various forms of sanctions, which, if they're strategically applied, will have the potential to put quite a lot of pressure on the junta. Apart from anything else, there have been reports that it's running short of cash to pay the army, so hopefully that pressure can put them into a vulnerable position. But in more general terms, these are incredibly wealthy people. We're not talking about people who are going to be affected by normal sanctions against the Myanmar economy. But ASEAN is possibly the key. ASEAN has taken a position against the coup with Indonesia, Malaysia, the strongest against. But there are issues such as implied recognition if there is engagement with the junta through ASEAN. And there has already been backlash against Indonesia, for example, for suggesting that perhaps, good idea, someone thought of an Indonesian foreign ministry. Maybe what we should do is try and hold Min Aung Hlaing to his promise to hold elections within 12 months. The democracy movement and the ethnic community said no. We've had an election. We have an elected government last November. It was a legitimate election, and that is the government that we want to see return. So the Indonesians had to pull their head in, and maybe there's some other sort of mediated process in play. ASEAN is becoming a bit split, so it's said. And of course, their concern is that if they completely turn their back on Myanmar, you've got dear old Putin hanging in the wings, waiting to fill the space. China may stand back if the junta can give some guarantee of protection of Chinese interests, and you'll be aware that in addition to the corridor, there are huge Chinese interests in Myanmar, and there have been some burning of factories, Chinese factories in the Langtia industrial zone and on the outskirts of Yangon. So the Chinese are really worried about their interests. That doesn't necessarily manifest itself in telling or pressuring the junta to go back to barracks. If they could get some credible assurance that their economic transport corridor is going to be secure, then they'd probably be happy to sit back and see the military suppress the popular movement. But that may be a bit more difficult if the Tatmadaw resources, the army resources, are being drawn constantly to having to engage with the popular movement in all parts of the country. That's okay. It's 400,000 troops, but they move in big numbers, and it's going to draw off a lot of that resource in their fight with the movement. But even more significantly, the ethnic armies are also taking steps to defend their own. And that sort of escalating civil war is likely to concern the Chinese. But then standing to the side is Russia. So I said the Defence Minister was in Naypyidaw a week before the coup. His deputy was back there on Saturday. They're clearly right there with Min Aung Hlaing in the actions that he's taking. I don't understand quite for what reasons. It seems to me it must be just strategic, politically strategic, because their trading interests with Myanmar are very minimal. So option 2 is probably the most possible option, albeit a difficult one to achieve. The third scenario is an escalating civil war, a kind of Syria scenario. The coup and the escalating violence of the army seems to be drawing many of the ethnic armed organisations together. And they're certainly declaring their interests in actually escalating their military action against the Burmese army to protect their own people. And several have already made declarations publicly that that's what they're doing and have started doing it. The KIA, Korean Independence Army in the north, and the Korean army in the east, and also, surprisingly, the Arakan army over in the west. And it's also been reported in recent days that the CRPH, this kind of interim government, has been contacting ethnic armed groups and building support for a coordinated attack on the on the military. So I guess this scenario sees Myanmar descending into an escalation of the civil war, which has simmered, for 60 years, in which so much effort in the last 10 years has been put into resolving as part of the democratic transition. Obviously, that's the horror scenario, one to be avoided, but it's also a very real possibility. So that's kind of the end of my substantive comments, but I just want to conclude with a few comments about our union work, because I guess we all feel, what can we do? Is there anything, that we can do or should have done? We've been working as a union movement in New Zealand internationally with the international union movement for, well, more than 30 years now around the restoration of democracy and the abuse of human rights in Myanmar. And there's no doubt that the sustained pressure on the military, planned and implemented by unions, business and government through the tripartite processes of the International Labour Organisation on issues like forced labour and freedom of association, played a key role in achieving the transition to democratic rule in the years from 2010. And UnionAid has been active for almost 20 years, initially as a CTU international program, and for the past 11 years as a separate development agency and registered charity. As well as union building projects, our work has included the Myanmar Young Leaders program, which is a program that brings, funded by our New Zealand Aid program, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which brings now 12 young leaders from Myanmar to New Zealand. There's no media here, is there? Because this has been a very low-profile program. It started under military rule in 2009, effectively. We tried to get it going in 2008. And it's been, initially it was directed at providing young people under that military rule with at least some knowledge and ideas about how democracy operates, or how a democratic society operates, in the hope that at some stage they might get the opportunity, albeit at a grassroots level, to exercise them. Well, it actually came all of a sudden in 2010, with the transition to democracy. So our program changed to a leadership program which helped them to take ideas from how we do things in New Zealand, or perhaps ideas of how not to do things because of the way we do things in New Zealand, back to their own country and build their capacity as leaders in their communities with an understanding of what it means to operate democratically, both at a government level and at a society level. Sadly, COVID prevented that program going ahead this year, and who knows what will happen now. But our hope was that that group, which is now 95 alumni of the NYLB program, would lead the building of a democratic country in Myanmar. Now, the 95 alumni are effectively on the barricades, fighting again for democracy, because they understand and saw what democracy can be like, and they're determined that they're not going to give up without a fight. One of them said to us, as far as he was concerned, it's do or die, because he's not going to allow the situation to exist lightly, with a military rule being left as his legacy for his children. So we worry about them as if they are our children, and we worry about their safety. But we have to support their own choice to take this inspiring, albeit very risky, campaign strategy. And we are. An initial appeal that we've quietly launched, raised $12,000. We've been a little bit quiet about it because we weren't absolutely sure whether we'd be able to get money into Myanmar to support the striking workers and to support the campaign and to support people who are experiencing hardship. But we have found a way of doing that, and we have been able to get money to striking railway workers who were thrown out of their homes, to airport workers, to who else might? Teachers and women's groups in Kachin, and nurses and journalists, yeah. Hopefully we can get more funds and to provide that vital support for this movement to continue. So I'll just conclude by asking for your support in any way you can. Giving money, but just prevailing on government to keep this issue at the forefront of our minds and our strategies to help sustain the fight back for democracy and to pressure the governments of the world to intervene. Because without that, as I said with option 2, it's not going to happen, and it's going to be another tragedy in a long history of tragedies in that very sad country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, for that really interesting gathering together of all the history, which was really informational and insightful, and also for the 3 scenarios of, how you think things might go, which are deeply worrying. I think the involvement of Russia and China are the bits that really, underneath it all feel very scary. And it seems to me in the end that even if you find a way of putting pressure on the army, somehow or other they have to have some face-saving way out of this, or I can't see why they would back down otherwise, and that seems to be a very difficult thing to think about. I think one of the bits that I really thought was interesting was the photograph you had there of the 3 people in the government with Aung San Suu Kyi and the man that had been in New Zealand with the army sitting behind.
That was probably the army vice president.
Yes, yeah. It was like, don't do anything, I'm here. And so it was, it's really interesting. I'm on the board of UnionAid, and in a wee while might come up just to talk about what we have done to raise money and what we're going to do. Because tonight we've managed to bring together 2 people, someone who lived in Myanmar, who has got a proposal for a fundraiser. So from now, I'd like to ask if any of you would like to ask some questions of Ross or make any comments, to keep them reasonably brief, and we'll have a microphone here to go to whoever wants to. Right.
Okay, who's first?
Pardon?
If you point to the first.
Ken over there.
And if people couldn't pass around the microphones, that would help. Thanks.
That was very interesting, Ross. My question is that if the suppression carries on from the military, and it escalates with more and more being killed and dying, and particularly young, could you see a division coming in the military, and because of say outside governments sort of voicing their dissatisfaction of what's going on, that internally there could be a change, that the general now who's in charge could be ousted, and that they realise that they need to change before the problem escalates? Yeah,
a good question. I've thought about that myself, because quite a lot of the generals behind Min Aung Hlaing are in their 50s and late 40s. They're quite young. And there was just the hope that they might be a little bit more enlightened than their leader. And they may well be, I don't know. I mean, it's a very, very strong culture in Myanmar. They live separately. They own a lot of resources, including film companies. They make their own propaganda films about, you know, what they're doing and what they're up against. All fake news, of course. You know, they show the soldiers, the troops, films about the students in 1988, you know, slicing soldiers into pieces without mentioning that it was actually 33,000 students that got killed, not many soldiers. The other thing that kind of mitigates against it a bit is that I understand that the military in Myanmar have an extremely efficient internal intelligence system. You're right, they don't trust each other one bit. And one of the reasons it's said why they moved to transition to democracy was that the reigning general at the time wanted to retire, and what's happened in the past is that when generals step down, they're locked up by their successor. So, you know, they don't necessarily like each other, they don't trust each other, but then I don't think with that intelligence system, whatever they thought, and I think they've been pretty strongly brainwashed into believing this national saviour role that they kind of believe in, that's likely to happen. There were a few police who defected earlier in the process who just refused to shoot, you know, fellow citizens in cold blood. The police are actually part of the army, effectively. There's no properly trained police force in Myanmar. They're not, you know, dependent on a mandate from the population in the way that the police here. They're just a branch of the military.
Yeah, that was also my question, so a very good question. The other question is, what's the role of the Biden administration in some areas of foreign policy? They're pretty terrible, I know, particularly towards the Palestinians, but is the Biden administration different from Trump in terms of their reaction to Myanmar, or what?
Well, some sort of sources told me that some hope was held out for the kind of summit meeting between, you know, the Secretary of State and the Chinese. Was it last week or the week before? They thought, obviously, their interests were different, but perhaps their interests in getting Min Aung Hlaing back into the box might coincide around for different reasons. But it appears, certainly from media reports, that they just spent the time calling each other names, and childish behaviour never got down to serious issues. So there's been certainly no suggestion that anything emerged out of that. I think Biden's position on the Myanmar is pretty strong. I mean, he expressed genuine outrage about what happened on Saturday. What that manifests itself in terms of tangible action is, if the past is anything to go by, is likely to be targeted sanctions. And you know, they've already sanctioned the generals, their families, the big military holding companies that you know, control their assets. They've frozen Myanmar reserves in the Federal Reserve in the United States. What will they do more than that? I don't know. I don't see them. Certainly won't be committing to an invasion, that's for sure. No, I know.
Can I just say before anybody else, because I know people start to leave about now, that we are donating all the money that people normally give tonight for a koha to UnionAid for Myanmar. So if you can remember that as you're on your way out, the koha bag is at the back. The next question, up here at the back. Can... I
just wanted to ask Ross, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Just interested to know what would be the wish of the striking workers and the other people in Myanmar that people in other countries can do. One occurred to me was whether we direct our attention at protests at the New Zealand Parliament or at the embassies of China and Russia. because there are, when you talk about tangible action, there are a lot of people who want to do something. So I was wondering if the wish of the people there would be that we're drawing attention to these other, there were 8 countries that provided troops on that chart: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, a couple more, America, Soviet Union and China. So what do you think would be the best action that we should be concentrating on?
Yeah, I mean, all of those. I think the message we're getting is that they just want us to, you know, continue to do whatever we can to raise the issue, to put pressure on the government, to put pressure on governments internationally to get the UN to act. I mean, several of them have raised the right to protect document, the duty to protect the citizens of your country, and that sort of rolls on to, you know, a duty on other countries to provide that protection if the country itself is not providing them. Well, you can't get more blatant than what the military are doing currently to their own citizens that they're supposedly obliged to protect. But, you know, anything, John, they just want us to do what we can to put pressure on governments to hopefully translate into sufficient pressure to force the military back into the barracks.
There's a meeting on Wednesday night, so maybe we can discuss that then in terms of what our local things are doing. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, would there be any international interest to destabilize the region apart from military industry and maybe secret services?
Sorry,
Would there be any international interests to destabilize the region? Would you know?
In the destabilisation in the region?
The region.
Yes. I mean, I think I probably didn't explain it very well, but I think, you know, all of those key countries are concerned about the destabilisation. You know, Singapore is very concerned about the destabilisation because they've got huge business investments there. The Chinese are concerned about destabilisation because of the economic and transport corridor. But what would resolve their concern? I mean, you've provided the word, stability. And stability, from their perspective, doesn't necessarily mean a democratic government. It means a military junta that's actually managed to establish control. Hence, the increasing ruthlessness. I don't accept that the Chinese are concerned about, you know, the ruthless massacres. I would think that the junta are desperately trying to gain control by being more and more ruthless in order to reassure the Chinese in particular that they actually have and can maintain that sort of stability.
Ross, I just wanted to ask about the Buddhist monks. I know groups of them supported the military in the violence against the Rohingya, but I've not seen in many of the information we've been receiving Buddhist monks saying or doing anything in support of the people. Have you? No,
that's been quite curious, hasn't it? There hasn't been much evidence of the monks. You know, the monks in Myanmar are perhaps a bit different from what we might expect them to be. You know, most of the monks in Myanmar are not religious monks. You know, they're there because the monastery provides them with somewhere to live. So they're not reading scriptures. I don't say most, but many of them are not educated. And then you have the kind of religious monks, who are the ones that would be concerned. And then you have the Buddhist nationalist monks, the ones that supported, you know, the Rohingya and actually promoted the Rohingya massacres. And, you know, that's a movement through Asia which has kind of had hold in other countries. Sri Lanka, for example, is probably the root of that very nasty Buddhist nationalism. And so yeah, you can't, the monks don't stand for anything in particular. I think they're kind of spread across the spectrum in reality.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I was wondering about the role and the potential influence of Aung San Suu Kyi,
Yes.
given the fact that she completely discredited herself on the issue of the Rohingya. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, good question from a Western perspective. She discredited herself in the eyes of the West by her actions or failure to speak out and defend the Rohingya. In Myanmar, it doesn't seem to have made any difference. I mean, if you actually measure the election results, and I'm not suggesting that they voted on the Rohingya issue, she increased her majority from 2015 to 2020. So, you know, this is a country where the 60 years of military rule had a very, very deep impact on all of the society, institutions, even their religion, Buddhism. And they just don't see things the way we saw that issue. We managed to get our students to see the issue through the prism of citizenship. Shouldn't everybody have a right of citizenship in some country? And if they have a right of citizenship, shouldn't they have all the rights that other citizens have? And of course, you know, you have to agree with that. But no, in Myanmar it didn't make any difference, certainly in the longer term, to Aung San Suu Kyi's. And I think, to be fair to her, she's obviously quite a cynical politician. I'm not sure what her beliefs are. Some suggest that she's got some rather sort of prejudiced views herself, but I haven't seen evidence of that. I don't know her. But certainly in taking the position that she did, she survived what was essentially a military and Buddhist nationalist attempt to kind of paint her as a kind of proxy of the West and reflecting Western values above the values of Myanmar and its national religion, Buddhism.
Okay, thank you. I think, well, we'll have one more question and then we'll finish.
India, I mean, their biggest neighbor. So what role will India have in this whole problem?
Yeah. Well, I think Mr. Modi will be probably watching it quite carefully, because I don't think he's anyone who's particularly keen on having to endure future elections by popular vote. I think he'd be quite happy to be in a situation of being in power in perpetuity. But as you can see from the data, I mean, India has been a major supplier of hardware, mainly naval vessels to Myanmar over the years. The position that they've taken on the coup is kind of supposedly neutral, but you know, I would say that there's tacit support there for the junta, and there were reports, I think, just 2 days ago that the Modi government was actually taking steps to prevent people from Myanmar crossing the borders, refugees from the conflict. So, you know, that's an indication.
What do you think India's interest is not for China to have that?
So, sorry, what was that?
India's interest is not to have China having access to that. So,
They're squeezed in the middle, that's true.
Yeah, that is it. China will have easy access to the British government.
Yeah. Yes, and China's been a more dominant interest, you know, historically than India has. But, you know, India is an emerging power and it has an increasing influence there. It's interesting, historically, the Chinese army has never defeated the Burmese army. But on the other hand, the Burmese army's never really defeated the Chinese army. They invaded Burma several times to try as part of warfare, and they died in the swamps during the rainy season. They got caught in the terrible mud and the rain. There's a long history there, but the Burmese people have never been defeated in battle by the Chinese.
I think we'll maybe finish it on that one. I think just before I go, Michael's disappeared. So, Katie, you said you'd spoken to Michael about something that might happen. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Katie Julian. I've lived in Myanmar since 1995-ish, working in education organisations. Me and some of my friends are organising a fundraiser on the 16th of April at St. Peter's Hall, Paikakariki. We're hoping to have speakers, some food, and a cabaret show. And some of the proceeds, I haven't quite discussed this with Michael yet, how much, but certainly at least half of the proceeds will go to UnionAid and some of them to some civil, for some of the people in the CDM movement who we are supporting from Paikakariki.
Okay.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Yep.
Yeah, more information about this will be forthcoming, but 16th of April in Paikakariki.
Okay, thank you. And Michael said, and this is particularly for people who are not in the room at the moment but listening elsewhere, that the UnionAid website is now open for donations again for Myanmar around this event. So if anybody feels the mood to help with this, and I think it's obvious tonight that it's a really worthwhile thing to do, then when you get home, please put some money in to the campaign, because we will make sure it gets to where it's needed. Thank you very much, everybody.